Good afternoon. Welcome to those in the classroom and to our Zoom audience. Just a few announcements before we start the program. First of all, the August monthly program will be hosted tomorrow, Tuesday, August 2nd at the Jack Miller Center for Musical Arts. It's entitled Exploring Ottawa County, and it's presented by Jason Shamblin, who's the director of the Ottawa County Parks and Recreation Commission. The doors open at 9 with the presentation beginning at 9:30. So join us on the way to the voting booth tomorrow. Remember, you're supposed to vote. Okay. You're also invited to join virtually versus live stream. And then the second announcement is that you're invited to join us for HASP hour tomorrow afternoon at 2:30 here in the HASP office. You can meet other HASP members, talk about what you're currently reading, enjoy a cookie or two. Okay, 2 announcements. Third announcement, please vote tomorrow. Good afternoon. My name is Jan Dahlman. I'm coordinator for this session with Dr. Joel Toppen. And his topic today is what went wrong with Russia and Ukraine. Joel is a professor at Hope College, starting there in 1997. So he's going to be entertaining his 25th anniversary soon. At Hope, he teaches U.S. foreign policy, global political economy, and introduction to global politics. With students, he's traveled to Japan, Rwanda, and Tanzania. And with research, he's worked in Mozambique, South Africa, and Uganda. Educationally, he holds a BA from Hope, and both his MA and PhD are from Purdue in Indiana. Yes, thank you, Indiana people. And his focus was on international relations. He is also a professional consultant with International Relief for Food Insecurity. If you've been around Holland, you know that his father was with Hope. And if you know Mary Toppen, you know that she's his mom. Having heard Joel once, I am here to tell you that he's very entertaining, but focused, data-oriented, and very engaging. So I'm sure you'll have a very delightful afternoon learning about what went wrong with Russia and Ukraine. Welcome, Joel. Please welcome him.
Thank you, Jan, and thank you, everyone, and thank you to Ian and everyone else here at HASP who does such wonderful work. It's a pleasure to speak with this group again. I was remembering this morning that the first time that I spoke to a HASP group was in 1996, and I was pretty green and finishing up my PhD from Purdue and started teaching at Hope. And so it's been a little bit, and it's always a pleasure. Jan was kind to mention some credentials. The most important credential is that my mom is married. That beats a PhD and all that stuff. But I was thinking back upon those days when I was planning to go to graduate school after my undergrad years here at Hope College, and friends of the family or aunts and uncles would ask, well, what are you planning to do? And oh, I'm going to go to graduate school. Oh, that's great. And what are you going to study? And I said, I'm going to study political science. And many folks said, oh, you want to be a politician, do you? I said, no, I don't want to be a politician. I want to study politicians and I want to study politics, but no. And it made me think that, like if I had said, I'm going to study ornithology, oh, you want to be a bird, do you? Right? No, I want to study birds, right? But I do imagine that most ornithologists actually at times wish they were birds or have that desire. So I say that by way of introduction to say that I'm trying to provide some analysis as a political scientist of what's happening with Ukraine and Russia. Uh, and that analysis is from a step removed. I'm not a participant in that war, in this war. Although we all, tomorrow is election day, we all are political actors as well. But today I want to put on the hat of a political analyst and provide some analysis from a step removed with some distance. And I say this because I don't want to ever forget the tragedy, the human tragedy that all war is, but this particular war as well. Massive amounts of human suffering. And so, it's somewhat easy for me to step back and look at maps and provide this distant, somewhat distant analysis without feeling the intensity of the human suffering. So I want to say that to reassure you that I think about that, the human suffering part as well. But today I want to try to provide some analysis to help us understand what's going on and what went wrong. And also, I want to say that I spent the last several weeks, 3 weeks on vacation. And so in the last week, this is the New River Gorge National Park. It's the most recent national park, newest national park in the U.S. Park Services system in West Virginia. And there's not a lot of good internet service in the gorge. And so I've been, since we returned home, my wife and I last night, I've been trying to make sure I'm up to date and current on the situation. So I put some work into that. Okay, so there are 3 battlefields that I think of when we think of what's happening in Ukraine and Russia's invasion. The first is obviously a military battlefield with traditional, tanks, artillery, fighting for territory, and that physical kind of old school 20th century kind of a battlefield that some have thought maybe global politics has been moving away from, but that certainly is primary in this case. And then also a second battlefield that we can think of is an economic battlefield, or there's economic warfare going on, and particularly the US-led and European-led effort to isolate Russia and to put economic pressure on Russia. And so there's certainly an economic battlefield element to it. And a third battlefield is perhaps a information battlefield or propaganda battlefield, or the battlefield of ideas of what is happening. And certainly what we're seeing in Russia with the restrictions on freedom of the press and a certain message being put forward to the Russian people. And of course, in Ukraine, with President Zelensky and the government of Ukraine countering that ideational or informational campaign and battleground. I often tell my students that nobody has ever started a war saying we're the bad guys. Right? So for me, in this case, my bias is I have strong feelings as not just an analyst, but as someone who has political opinions and as a political actor. I have a strong bias. I think it's very clear in this case who the bad guys are, and who the aggressors are, and therefore who the good guys are as well. Bad Vlad is certainly worthy of that name. But the Russian people, Vladimir Putin didn't say, hey, those Ukrainians, they're the good guys. Let's go get them, right? We're the bad guys. Let's go get them. So it's important to understand, kind of to put yourself into the mindset almost of the aggressor, and how the perspective is quite different. During the Cold War, a colleague and friend of mine, political scientist Tony Smith, wrote a somewhat controversial book called Thinking Like a Communist. And so certain people were critical of thinking that he was an apologist of communism and trying to show, no, it makes sense from this perspective, but that wasn't his intent. His intent was to say, if we're combating communism, or if we're fighting this Cold War and in support of liberal democracy and trying to defeat the advance of communism, that we should try to understand the perspective of the adversary. And so this map that I'm showing here is important in this respect, to understand the mindset of the aggressor in this case. So, as you see, it's entitled NATO Enlargement, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, of course, created in the 1940s. In 1949, we get its start. And this period of time post, and I'm sorry, I'm sure that many of you know this history better than I do, but I do want to kind of run through it just to provide context. So in this period after World War II is when the so-called liberal international order is put into place. The liberal international order, a network of international institutions, multilateral institutions that together make up what we call the liberal international order. And the NATO alliance was a part of this. Of course, so was the United Nations, so was the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, economic institutions, the precursor to the World Trade Organization, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the GATT, that also began in the 1940s after World War II. So this is important context, and I'll get back to the significance of the liberal international order. But of course, the purpose of NATO was to contain or to provide a deterrent to the Soviet Union at the time. Then in 1989, of course, the Cold War comes to an end. We see democratic revolutions throughout Eastern Europe, the collapse of communism in these formerly Soviet bloc countries in Romania and Bulgaria and Poland. And the Cold War comes to an end. And the US and the West, Western Europe and the liberal democracies prevailed. And communism collapsed and the Soviet Union lost. And in fact, then in 1991, the Soviet Union falls apart into 16 separate republics, Russia, of course, being the largest one. Vladimir Putin has called the dissolution of the Soviet Union the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. And I think that's important to think about. So that includes World War I, that includes World War II, that includes the Nazi Holocaust. He's saying the greatest catastrophe was the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And so what we see from the NATO alliance is then in this period, the expansion of NATO. And so former members of the Soviet bloc, members of the Warsaw Pact, which was essentially the counter alliance to NATO, so the Soviet-led Warsaw Pact. These countries then essentially switched sides and joined with the NATO alliance. And so it was a great geopolitical loss for Russia as NATO expanded. And so this is really important to understanding the logic. I think it's more of an illogic to Russia's decision to invade Ukraine, but it's a very important part of the story. To see Putin's view of NATO enlargement as an expansion, as aggression. Right? So in his view, in Russia's view, the mainstream view is that it is actually the West, it's the US, it's Western Europe, it's NATO who are the aggressors. And Russia is simply defending itself, defending fellow Russians, whether they reside in Russia or whether they reside in Ukraine or in other neighboring nation states. So this is important to understand that from this view, the expansion and the creeping of NATO closer and closer to the borders of Russia. And so Ukraine right here, of course, had been promised eventual NATO membership. And this was, from the view of Putin, an aggressive act by the West and a kind of a line in the sand that he would not allow to be crossed. In a few years back, historian John Dower wrote an award-winning book about Japan in the post-World War II era, and the book is entitled Embracing Defeat. And the idea that Dower lays out in this excellent book is that the defeat of Japan in World War II was so complete and so overwhelming that it couldn't be denied by the Japanese. That the idea was, oh, well, we didn't really lose, right? That we're still a major world power. No, right? It was complete and utter defeat. So in terms of rebuilding Japan, Dower makes the case that the Japanese leadership and Japanese people had to embrace defeat and they had to accept it full on. And so my view of Putin's Russia is that there is no embracing of defeat in the Cold War. So Putin is, instead of wanting to embrace defeat, he's trying to erase defeat or replace defeat and replace it with a renewed Russian empire, or to renew Russia's superpower status as a great world power. And instead of accepting the defeat that to others was quite obvious. And so somewhat like President Xi in China, you could say that the goal for Putin is to make Russia great again. Right? And so this is an effort that we see by leaders, not just in the United States, but throughout the world, and especially among great powers. Right? Bolsonaro, say in Brazil, has some funny ideas, right? But he's not claiming to Brazilians that we are the dominant power. We are a world leader. We are a global superpower. They kind of understand the limited role that Brazil has in global politics, but not so with Putin and with Russia. And just to reiterate or to support that point, this is an image of global GDP, and this may be a couple years out of date, but you see the incredible economic power and size of the United States. And this helps, by the way, when the US is using economic sanctions and economic tools to put pressure on Russia, to punish Russia, to try to deter further aggression by Russia. So for example, if you were Australia and you put economic sanctions on Russia, it has limited effect. But also to make the point, China, yes, is growing in economic power. China is the second largest economy in the world, depending on how you measure it. Some have said that China may have already surpassed the size of the US economy, but not quite yet, but significant economic heft and significant economic power. Russia clearly is not in that category. You see here the size of the economy, the GDP in Russia, $1.6 trillion dollars. And so about the size of Brazil, and in fact, a little bit smaller, in fact, than Brazil. So the fact is that Russia is not a global superpower. They certainly have the world's largest collection of nuclear weapons. And so that brings a significant amount of power and security risk to it. But Russia is not what it once was as a global superpower. So this NATO enlargement, I want to go back to 2007. Realist scholars of international relations who are considered to be realists to say that global politics is an anarchical environment. There's global anarchy, meaning essentially there's no global government. The United Nations, the liberal international order, yes, these are multilateral institutions, but they don't have authority or power over nation states. Nation states are sovereign. They have sovereignty. And in this anarchical environment, then nation states depend upon themselves to provide for their own security. So it's what realist scholars would say is a self-help system. They have to depend upon themselves. And in this anarchical environment, then conflict between nation states is inevitable. There's a security dilemma inherent in the system. Right? The system of anarchy requires nation states to pursue power, and power and security are relative concepts. So if India becomes more powerful militarily, then Pakistan feels threatened. And if Pakistan becomes more powerful militarily, then India becomes threatened. So a security dilemma in which action taken only to advance one's own security actually results in the insecurity of others. And this is what we call the security dilemma. So from the perspective of the United States and its Western allies, the enlargement of NATO is not offensive. It's not aggressive. It's not threatening. We're not threatening anyone. We're only trying to defend ourselves. We're only trying to defend these liberal democracies, and countries are required to be, Turkey, maybe not so much anymore, but are required to be liberal democracies in order to join this military alliance. And it's purely defensive, right? But of course, Russia and Putin, they don't see it that way. The expansion of NATO, the defensive nature is seen as aggression, is seen as an offensive gesture, encroaching upon Russia and Russia's interests. So what has Putin accomplished in this war? I think this is an important lesson about what's happening, is that it's about the limitations of military power, right? So realists would say, it's about power politics. It's about this competition of power. But we see with the invasion of Ukraine, the limits of military power. And so you could say that we've also seen this in recent experience that the United States has had as the world's preeminent military power in Iraq, or say in Afghanistan. And so, yes, the military power is overwhelming, but what does it get you, right? What are the accomplishments of it? Particularly in an offensive way, when it involves invading other countries or attacking other countries. In a defensive manner, you could argue certainly military power is just as relevant and useful as it has ever been, but the limits of military power from an offensive perspective. So one of the things as it relates to NATO is, what has Putin accomplished? He's accomplished unifying NATO. He's accomplished a re-envisioning or a recommitment to the liberal international order, which includes NATO, which includes the G7, the group of 7 largest economies in the world. It includes a commitment to the European Union. Even the United Kingdom, even the British are, even though they've left the EU, but have joined with the EU to have a common approach to addressing the conflict in Europe. And of course, so now Finland and Sweden are moving to join NATO. So Putin has accomplished the exact opposite of what his security goals have been in terms of trying to weaken NATO or divide the alliance. The NATO members have a renewed sense of purpose and say, oh, this is why we have NATO. Right? This is why, this is our reason for being. And then also, of course, the expansion of NATO to include Sweden and Finland, perhaps eventually down the road, that would include Ukraine. Also, in terms of the list of Putin's accomplishments, and that's in quotations, accomplishments. And what I mean is he's accomplished the exact opposite of what his goals are. On the economic front, for example, The Economist magazine estimates that in this year, 2022, Russia's economy will shrink by 10%. Its GDP, where the US is struggling, oh, we only have 2% economic growth, or, Russia's economy is going to contract by 10% in a single year. And certainly that was not what Putin had in mind originally to accomplish. I want to talk a little bit about Ukrainian politics. I'm not an expert in Ukrainian politics, but I've followed it fairly closely for quite some time. And so this map, I think, is helpful for us to understand some of the dynamics within Ukraine. This is the 2010 presidential election results. In the United States, of course, we have red states and we have blue states. And in Ukraine, we have yellow provinces or oblasts. I'm not sure about the pronunciation of that word. I think that's close. These provinces, they're yellow provinces and there are blue provinces. And the distinction is not necessarily a political party distinction like we see in the United States, but it is about whether Ukraine should join with the Western liberal European democracies and have a tighter alliance, perhaps joining the European Union, perhaps joining NATO eventually, or whether Ukraine should join and fit into the Russian sphere of influence and identify more strongly with Russia. So the regions that are highlighted in blue have a much higher percentage of the population that identify as Russian. So these are Russian speakers. They think of themselves as Russians who live in Ukraine, but their identification is to join with Russia. Whereas the Western parts of the country, the yellow parts of the country, are more Ukrainian speakers, less of a strong identification with Russia, and more of an identification as Europeans. And people, particularly, there's also a generational difference here, that young folks, university students in Kiev and in these Western regions, they want to be part of Europe. The future, the 21st century, they don't think it's in Russia. They think it's in the West. It's with the European democracies and with freedoms, political freedoms, as well as economic freedoms. And so this is a big political divide within Ukraine. Should we join with Europe? Should we join and be part of the Russian sphere of influence or empire, as it were? In 2004, the first 21st century revolution in Ukraine occurred, a democratic revolution called the Orange Revolution in 2004. It was part of the so-called color revolutions in Georgia and Kyrgyzstan, other places that were moving not as quickly as 1989 and some of the other places, but eventually moving toward democracy and democratic revolution. And of course, Vladimir Putin, who had recently come to power in Russia after the decline of Boris Yeltsin, saw this again as Western aggression. He doubted that these revolutions were actually homegrown, that the people of these places were rising up and they were demanding freedom and they were demanding democracy and demanding political change. He actually, Putin is a bit of a conspiracy theorist, and he believed that it was the West, and particularly the US, that was pulling the strings of this so-called democratic uprising. So his attempt was to put down these color revolutions, and he of course thought that they were yet another example of US aggression. The context of the 2003 Iraq War is also important here, that for Putin and for many Russians, that's all part of it. That the US is the aggressor, that the US is the one who wants to dominate. The US is the imperial power that wants to rule the world and decide how other governments should be run. And this is important to make this point. 2007, Putin gives a very famous speech at the Munich Security Conference. They have an annual security conference in Munich. It's attended by world leaders. Usually. And in 2007, Putin got up himself and gave a speech in front of Western leaders who were sitting about this close to him. And he said, it's over. This unipolar moment, one dominant superpower, meaning the US, we're not going to take it anymore. We're not going to sit back and allow the US to dominate the world. Right? And of course, dominate in an aggressive, imperialistic, militaristic, warlike way, not in a democratic way. So from Putin's perspective, when the US and the West speak of democracy and human rights and democracy promotion and freedom and liberty, it's just talk from his perspective. He thinks that's a cloak, right? That Western leaders tell ourselves, or Westerners tell ourselves, that this is what it's really about. But for him, it's purely about power and domination. So he gives this famous speech in 2007. It's called the Munich speech, where he says, enough, it's over. We're not going to accept it, this US domination of the world. And so then shortly thereafter, in 2008, Russia invades Georgia. And the Republic of Georgia then had experienced also a color revolution of its own, moving toward democracy, moving towards an identification with the West and with Europe. And of course, this is unacceptable from Russia. So we see this invasion of Georgia in 2008. In 2010, Viktor Yanukovych, who's represented by the blue areas here, or that's where his most of his votes came from, is a Russian-backed political leader and former president of Ukraine. And he wins re-election in 2010. It's interesting side note, and maybe it's not a side note, maybe it's bigger than a side note, but his campaign manager at the time was one Paul Manafort. So he really rebuilt his political reputation in Ukraine by helping pro-Russian political leaders, including Viktor Yanukovych. And so Yanukovych rehabilitates himself. Manafort did a lot of work with him to polish his image. He got him to wear business suits and got him to clean up his language a little bit. And then he was returned to power in 2010. But the Ukraine-EU relationship had been continuing. And so in 2013, an agreement had been reached between Ukraine and the European Union, not for full membership within the EU, but moving in that direction and closer relations and becoming more coordinated between Ukraine and the EU. And of course, this is supported by a majority of Ukrainians, particularly those who identify more with Europe. And this was opposed by those folks in the Donbass region and the Russian speaking areas who didn't want to move into Europe's orbit or the West's orbit, but wanted to stay with the Russian sphere of influence. And so in 2014, Yanukovych, with pressure from Vladimir Putin, decides to pull out of the agreement and says at the last second, nope, we're not going to go with Europe. Essentially, we're going to go with Russia. And so this then initiates widespread protests. And this is the second revolution, democratic revolution in Ukraine of the 21st century. The so-called Maidan revolution or dignity revolution in Ukraine, and saying down with Yanukovych. We don't want to be with Russia. We don't want to be their puppet. We want to join with the Western liberal democracies of Europe. And so widespread protests that went on for months and months. Yanukovych initially tried to put down the protests with brutality and violence, and thousands of Ukrainian democracy protesters were killed in this effort. And it, of course, it only emboldened the protesters. So it, again, had this opposite effect that was intended. Instead of putting down the protests, it built them, and they grew and grew. And eventually, Yanukovych flees, and I don't have to tell you probably where he fled to, but Moscow. So Yanukovych is out, and democracy then returns to Ukraine. And so this is an important part of this story. 2014, then later in that year, after Yanukovych flees, Putin decides to invade the Ukraine and militarily takes the Crimean Peninsula, seen here. And that was in 2014. So the Crimean Peninsula, predominantly Russian identifying, Russian speaking region. And so Putin militarily annexes the Ukraine. And again, there's a theme here of having the opposite effect. So if you have a roughly evenly divided Ukraine, so think of the United States, red states, blue states, somewhat evenly divided. If in the US, say we got rid of California, then the balance shifts towards the other states. Yeah, question or comment? Yeah, right, right. So what ended up happening is he made, by annexing Crimea, he actually made Ukraine less pro-Russian, because Crimea was not part of the next set of elections in Ukraine. And then, of course, in this period also in 2014, these Russian areas of Donetsk and Luhansk were occupied by pro-Russian separatists, so militia groups that want to, it's not exactly clear, do they actually want independence as an independent pro-Russian republics? Putin, within the last year, had recognized them right before the invasion in February. He recognized them as independent republics, that they are not part of Ukraine, the Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts. Together, by the way, this region is referred to as Donbass or the Donbass region. And so it's a bit confusing in terms of some of the language there. But so the war in Ukraine, we could say it begins in 2014 in February rather, with the invasion of 2022. But really the war has been going on since 2014. And so there is a line of, kind of this line of contact and a kind of a stabilization of the war. But it's an ongoing military confrontation between these pro-Russian separatists and the government of Ukraine. And so this this region is now the kind of the heart of the battle. The original plan, it appears, by Putin was to overthrow the government, invade, attack Kiev, the capital city, and take over the whole country. And this failed miserably. And so what we've seen since February is somewhat of a retreat by Russian forces to focus on maybe we can achieve some victory in the Donbass and really take over the rest of this territory that Russia or pro-Russian separatists do not control. Also, the 2016, in terms of Russian intervention and military aggression, there was an escalation by Russia in Syria in support of Bashar al-Assad, and Putin is, from what I can tell, largely responsible for the survival of the regime, the brutal, horrific regime of Assad in Syria. But again, this trying to counter the West and counter the US, which was toppling Arab dictators or supporting the toppling of Arab dictators in the region. And I'm going to make a couple more points here, and then I would like to open up to questions or comments. But in terms of what is at stake in this conflict, and so at one point, it's a classic state versus state, nation state versus nation state kind of conflict. Russia invades Ukraine, it's Ukraine against Russia, state versus state. But also, I want to stress the significance of the liberal international order is perhaps at stake. And this is where Putin has, again, his strategy has backfired. He wants to weaken the liberal international order. He wants to weaken NATO, the European Union, all these multilateral institutions that he sees as threatening to Russia's interests. And in fact, the opposite has occurred in this place, in these cases. And so, and then also what's at stake is it's kind of a return to the Cold War in that this is about the survival of democracy in Ukraine against foreign military intervention. And also in terms of democracy, this battle between authoritarianism and democracy, Russia has become even more authoritarian since February 2022. Less political freedoms, less press freedom, etc. And even moving into what political scientists would call totalitarianism, where it's not just an authoritarian government or a dictatorship, but it's a totalitarian system where the state has absolute control and there are no political freedoms whatsoever. So, and this is why the West and the US have responded in the way that they have. All right. And it seems obvious to me that Putin has miscalculated that response, how unified the US and Europe and others have been, how significant the economic punishments and sanctions have been, and even at cost to themselves, more so for Europe even than to the US in terms of, paying more for energy that is now no longer coming from Russia. So taking on costs in order to object. I think Putin thought it would be essentially a repeat of 2014. Right, when he invaded the first time and took the Crimean Peninsula, and there was a slap on the wrist, and the U.S. said, "Oh, you shouldn't do that," and "Oh, there might have some limited sanctions," but essentially he got away with it without significant repercussions. And so I think his calculation was that would repeat itself, and that is, again, as I've said, not been the case. To wrap up, maybe there'll be a question about this, but I don't think the war is going to end until Putin goes. Right? There's not an option that I can see. There's not a logic that I can see that how this could end well or favorably. And so I think it's going to be an increasingly tragic situation in Ukraine. Also, I think it's important in terms of that kind of analysis that Zelensky, President Vladimir Zelensky of Ukraine, has continually reiterated that we're not going to give up an inch of Ukrainian territory. We're going to keep fighting until we get every single inch of Ukraine back. It's not clear to me, does he really mean Crimea? Right? I think he doesn't mean the Donbass region, right? And Kherson in the south and some of these other places. But there appears to be no willingness or inclination on the part of Zelensky to negotiate or to sue for peace with Russia and say, okay, we'll let you have the Donbass and then we can, maybe work something out. The commitment seems to be full and strong. And so particularly with support from the United States and from Europe, strong military support and economic support to continue the war effort for Ukraine's independence from Russian aggression. So with that, we'll entertain questions or comments, thoughts, and
Thank you, Joel.
Yeah.
We're going to let Jan and I will be making sure that everyone gets their questions answered, but please do not start asking your question till the microphone comes to you, just that way everyone can hear in our virtual session as well. A quick point of clarification, Joel, before we begin. When you say Donbass region, is that a geographic or a political region similar to like the Midwest?
Yes, great question. So it's a geographic region that includes usually the Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts or provinces here.
Okay, we'll start on the far end of the room over here.
Can you speculate at all about the potential demise of Putin?
Yeah, well, lots of, rumors and stories about that he has cancer or that he is, not sure what happened here, but that, that he's ill. And so that might explain the timing of this, that he wants to restore greater Russia while he still has a chance. Like this is his last effort or attempt. And like with, what's happening in China, how popular is she in China? Right? It's hard to know. Right. In authoritarian states where there's such a lack of press freedom and political freedom that you can, the opinion polls out of Russia say that Putin is very popular. If I were a Russian and asked by anyone, do you support Putin? I might just say yes. So I'm not sure. It's hard to gauge that. Right. We have seen, though, a number of protests in Russia against the war. So there has been, again, a kind of a pushback or an opposite effect of what Putin would want. Right? Dictators, political scientists talk about this two-level game that political leaders have going. On one hand, it's Russia versus Ukraine or Russia versus the United States or this kind of state versus state. But for dictators, their primary goal is to stay in power. So it's they're wanting to think about Russian politics. So they might invade another country only to support or reinforce their position of power domestically. And we have this kind of a rally around the flag effect. Right, that when there's a conflict with an outside force or an enemy outside of the nation, then that the country rallies generally around the leader in that way. And so, yeah, it's very difficult to tell. I mean, the word that you use is perfect, speculation, right? And then the U.S. has to be really careful, right? Because if the U.S. says we're calling for the removal of Putin, then it just reinforces the argument that he's making to Russians to say, see, they're after us. They're after me. They're after Russia. They want to weaken Russia. That's what it's all about. It's not about democracy. So it's a kind of fine line there.
Joe, we had a question from one of our online participants relating to the U.S. response there. Can you explain why the U.S. has not declared Russia an enemy country or a terrorist state at this point? And what would the implications of that declaration be?
Yeah. I mean, nuclear war is the fear. I mean, I don't want to be hyperbolic or, fear mongering, but the idea is that if the U.S. actually gets militarily involved, joins the war effort with U.S. planes, with U.S. troops attacking Russian troops, then we don't know where that would stop. And so again, it's kind of a fine line with the U.S. trying to support Ukraine, but not antagonize Russia even further. And Putin and his generals have repeatedly threatened nuclear war and repeatedly said, reminded the U.S. of, hey, we have nukes. Right. So you better, watch what you're doing and better think carefully. So during the period of NATO enlargement, the phrase was poking the bear. Right. That for many folks, NATO enlargement was unnecessary. The Cold War was won. It's over. What are we doing? By further encroaching towards Russia with NATO enlargement, that you're simply poking the bear, and you're better off not to poke the bear. Yes.
Yes, I have two questions. Number one, the geography of the Donbass. Can you flip that back up a minute?
You bet.
I'm assuming that's an area about the size of Indiana or Ohio. Is that a legitimate?
I think that's about right. Here's 50 miles. You see here on the map. So yeah, I'd say that's about right. So I just drove through Ohio yesterday. It's a little bigger.
Yeah. And the second question I have is changing the subject completely. The dictator of Belarus, I believe, is fairly elderly. If that's, I think I'm making a true statement. I know Putin will be 70 in October, and for this group, that's not elderly, but
springtime of his life.
But I think the guy, and I didn't look on my phone, and Belarus is more like in his 80s. What if he drops dead? What does that have to do with this story now?
And yeah, I didn't mention this, but yeah, in Belarus, they had an election, a disputed election in 2020, and the dictator Lukashenko was it was widely agreed that he was defeated in the election. And then, of course, he rigged the results. And it said, he didn't even just say that he won, like, oh, it was close, I got 55% of the vote. He came out and claimed, I got 85% of the vote, right, with multiple candidates. And so the democratic revolution in Belarus, which is ongoing to push Lukashenko out of power, it's all part of the context of Putin sees it as this is the West. This is not Belarusians trying to demand democracy for themselves. This is the manipulation and the string pulling by the U.S. and by the West to displace a pro-Russian leader in Belarus with a democratic president.
Currently, with the way things are being fought, is there any prayer that Ukraine can prevail?
Reading today about this counteroffensive that was recently started by Ukraine. I'm no military analyst or specialist, but widely thought that defending is easier than going on the offensive. And so Ukraine has recently, within the last few days, I guess, really begun a counter-offensive in the south and not just in the Donbass. And so the city of Kherson in the south, near to Crimea, and this article here that I have on the screen from today's Wall Street Journal is saying that this could be a turning point. That if Ukraine is successful in retaking Kherson, this counteroffensive in the south is successful, that maybe it could actually turn the tide. Yeah, it's interesting that I didn't mention anything about US intelligence or Western intelligence, but most everybody thought that this would be a cakewalk for Russia, that Russia is superior, far superior in terms of military power and force, and that Kiev would fall in a few days and the war would be over soon. And so most of us have been surprised, in my case, pleasantly surprised at the ability of Ukraine's military to resist. And so some have argued that this is a failure of Western intelligence, that, we kind of missed the boat on that one. But it's also, I think, that if you remember in the months leading up to February, that President Biden and the administration was saying, no, they're going to invade. Right? They had a special military operation. They're moving hundreds of thousands of troops near the border, and Putin, of course, saying no, it's just special operations and maneuvers and training. And President Biden and others were saying, no, he's actually going to invade. And Zelensky himself was not pleased with that assessment, saying, hey, you're making it more likely to occur. But I think, I do think we've been surprised so far. And from what I've been reading, that there is a chance that it's not just, this hopeless cause that the US and European Union countries and the UK are just dumping millions and billions of dollars toward a lost cause, but that they think, no, that it actually could perhaps turn the tide. But what I think is more likely is this kind of stalemate situation and kind of almost a return to how the kind of live action fighting stopped or slowed down in 2014. That the kind of the status quo will continue. Yes.
You say the war may go on and on. How long do you think the U.S. will keep pouring all this money into them and equipment?
Yeah, right. And people say, well, Ukraine's not our fight. And this is interesting, the politics of that, right? There is bipartisan agreement, which is refreshing to us in the United States these days, when a majority of Republicans and Democrats in Washington agree on, yes, we should support Russia. There are elements within both political parties in the US to say, we don't need to be involved. Maybe a little bit more of that on the right with nationalists who may support former President Trump, but we also see it with populists on the left, with folks like Bernie Sanders or Bernie Sanders type supporters to say, we don't need to be supporting war around the world, that we should withdraw or, kind of mind our own business and work on building bridges in the US, and instead of building bridges or providing military support to the Ukraine. But it seems to me, who knows what will happen in the upcoming elections and in 2024, but the traditional Republican leadership in Washington, Mitch McConnell and President Biden, are really on the same page in terms of continuing this support for Ukraine. As I said, there are populists on the left and the right who want to move in a different direction. But it seems to me that that kind of bipartisan support will continue for some time.
Joe, that's a what if question. And you have to put on your prognosticator's hat, but what would be different if President Trump was in the White House?
Yeah, that's a great question. Great question, right? He, of course, has said that Putin would not have invaded had he been, he wouldn't mess with me. So that's it. But that's a very interesting question and a great question. And yeah, we can't, it's what what we call a counterfactual, right? What would have happened if, Hitler wouldn't have attacked the Soviet Union, or what would have happened? And so it's counterfactual. We don't know. Interesting, though, to me, anyhow, that former President Trump's longest serving national security advisor, John Bolton, was asked a similar question, and he responded that, well, it was really unnecessary because during Trump's administration, according to Bolton, who was, again, his longest serving national security advisor, that President Trump was essentially doing Russia's work, doing Putin's work for him. And so there was no need to try to push back against this so-called US aggression, because President Trump had said that Russia should be reinvited and rejoin the G7, which they did after the end of the Cold War. It was the G8 for a bit there, and the group of 8 nations. And then when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014, then that's when the G7 said, okay, Russia's out. And of course, President Trump had said during his time in office that he would support Russia coming back in to the G8. He, of course, had said that, you know, NATO was obsolete and had not expressed significant support for NATO. Of course, that is a shared goal of Putin's. Former President Trump was critical of the European Union, that the European Union was not our friend, that the European Union was bad. Right? And again, these institutions that are part of this liberal international order that I referenced earlier, that President Trump had more of a nationalist, transactional approach, and didn't necessarily see the wisdom of supporting these multilateral institutions. And so in those cases, that was certainly part of Putin's agenda in terms of weakening if not destroying the liberal international order. So yeah, it's a very interesting question.
Joel?
Yes.
Historically, is there a pattern with the Ukrainian relationship with the Russian Empire, even before the communist revolution, that would explain this?
Yeah, that's a great question. And again, I am not an expert on Ukrainian history or Ukrainian politics. This is for me, a specific case of a broader set of global politics and international relations. But this is the narrative is of the history of Ukraine. And so Putin has famously said and given long speeches and written, treatises about this, that Ukraine, from his perspective, has always been a part of Russia historically, and that Ukraine doesn't really exist as an independent nation or has an independent identity. So he's made the case that it's always been part of Russia, and it's a fake country in essence, and it really is and always has been, from his perspective, part of Russia. And again, this is, and maybe you're thinking this along with me, this is again a theme, because so Putin wants to destroy any sense of an independent Ukrainian identity. And he wants to make the case and convince everyone that no, Ukraine is actually Russian, and it's part of Russia and doesn't have this independent national identity. And one of the things that we've seen is that, well, if Ukrainians didn't have an independent national identity before, they certainly do now, right? And what does it mean to be Ukrainian? It means to resist Russian aggression. Right? Not for all Ukrainians, of course, but to establish this independent, no, we are Ukrainians, and we are going to push back against Russian domination and aggression.
From my observation, it seems like the Russian war in Ukraine couldn't have gone any worse for Putin. And I can't personally see a face savings way, because he wants to stay in power. So, if he had to use nuclear weapons because his troops were losing on the ground to Ukrainians, I think he might do it, because otherwise he's saying, no, I've spent all this time in lives and loss of prestige for nothing.
Yeah, right. And that logic of saving face and convincing your domestic political population that you're winning. right? That we're actually winning. And so if say he could, get some sort of an agreement or a deal to say, okay, the Donbass region, Donetsk and Luhansk, they are independent or they're part of Russia, or they have even semi-autonomy, which is, I think, really what the goal would be, that then he could save face and could claim to Russians that we won and we're victorious and we've protected Russians, right? Who are being, he's even accused Ukraine of genocide against Russian speakers, that we need to save our people, and the idea that Russia doesn't simply exist within Russia's borders, but Russia exists wherever there are Russians and wherever there are Russian speakers. So in these regions, for example. And so, yeah, that's, I mean, the fear of escalation is certain, and it's, it's unknown. Some people would say, come on, don't worry about that. The threat of nuclear war, you're exaggerating, come on. From my perspective, I would have thought, well, why would Putin invade Ukraine? Makes no sense, right? Like, what has he won? He's won cities that are utterly destroyed, right? He's won 10% economic decline of his economy. He's won economic sanctions and punishment. He's won a population in Ukraine that will resist into the future, right? They're not ever going to accept that. So from my perspective, I would have said, he's not going to invade. That just doesn't make any sense. And particularly, I mean, I expected him to take military action in this region and to try to shear off Donetsk and Luhansk. But attacking Kiev and trying to overthrow the government, I certainly didn't see that coming. That seems to be a real major miscalculation, strategic miscalculation on his part. So when we say about, what will happen in the future, well, he might miscalculate again, right? The decision-making process doesn't seem to be very good. We're hearing reports that he's increasingly isolated and isolated himself from any advisors or any of his administration that would possibly push back on his aggression. And he's removed those naysayers, or folks have been purged from the Russian leadership. So, yeah, I mean, again, I don't want to be, hyperbolic or be a doom and gloom, or, to say, oh, tragedy's on its way, further tragedy, but I think it's a very serious risk. And that gets back to the point about why the US or Europe is not even more fully supportive of Ukraine, to try to manage or limit the situation. I actually think that the best case scenario in terms of ending the war sooner rather than later is for Donetsk and Luhansk to have some semi-autonomous status, so that they could have some self-rule. They wouldn't be controlled completely by Kiev and the national government, somewhat similar to Kurds in Iraq, that in northern Iraq, Kurdistan, there's Kurdish, not independence, but there's a degree of Kurdish autonomy that they're able to kind of manage their own affairs to a certain extent without strong control from the central government. And this would be advantageous from my perspective for Putin, more so than outright independence, because then he would have a willingness or an ability to influence the central government in Kiev, to say, if say Luhansk and Donetsk had a kind of a veto power, or they had some sort of say over the decisions of the central government, then of course that would be Putin having some sort of say over what the Ukrainian government would do. So I think that would be maybe the best option of bad options. But then it gets to this old conundrum of war, where, we want justice and we want peace, right? And justice and peace go together. And from my perspective anyhow, the hard truth is that they don't always, right? So the war crimes that are being committed, it's essentially mass murder, that we're reading about in the paper every day. Bombing civilian areas, bombing churches, bombing schools, bombing hospitals. It's mass murder. And so when I think about justice, I want Putin to be held accountable, right? And perhaps tried for war crimes and face justice. But that pursuit of justice, or at least my understanding of justice, would make peace much more difficult. Because if Putin is saying, okay, if I do a deal with you, then you're going to put me on trial for war crimes and I'm going to go away for the rest of my life, then no, there's no willingness then to negotiate peace if that's the option. So sometimes the desire for human rights campaigners often say international law and justice and these are war crimes and that kind of thing. And sometimes then the military planners would say, you're not helping the cause of peace. If you want to seek peace, or at least a cessation of the war, then you would maybe want to deal with the war criminals and make agreements with them and negotiate with the war criminals and say, okay, you can still stay in power, or you can have some way to save face or way to have a political future. And so, yeah, justice and peace at loggerheads sometimes.
Yeah, Joel, question from our online participant is asking, what's the difference between this 2022 action versus the 2014 annexation?
Yeah, good question. And it appears to be, in one way is it's a continuation. It's part of the same action in a certain respect. But also, as I had mentioned earlier, it seems to be quite distinct in terms of the effort to actually overthrow the government of Ukraine and to install essentially a Lukashenko type of person from Belarus, to install that pro-Russian dictator in, replace Zelensky and replace democracy. And so that seems to be a major distinction. But now that effort seems to, now they're on to plan B, Putin, or plan C or plan D, I'm not sure, that now it seems like it's more of the continuation of the same conflict, right? Holding on to Crimea, trying to, he has recognized the independence of Donetsk and Luhansk. And so in that way, it's just a continuation of the 2014 war. One big difference, though, is the reaction of the West and of the US. And so, a lot of times people criticize economic sanctions, like, oh, economic sanctions, they don't work. Dictators respond to guns and bombs. They don't respond to, economic fines or, economic sanctions, slaps on the wrist, that they're really not effective. But one of the things that is different this time is the economic sanctions put on by the US and primarily by Europe and a few others. We've never seen it, something like this. We've never seen the severity of economic sanctions put on a major economy like this. It's really, really unprecedented. And so that's one thing that's quite distinct. And that helps contribute to the, 10% GDP, shrinkage in a single year for Russia. The economic costs are quite significant. And it's almost as if Putin has revitalized and re-energized the liberal international order. And this multilateralism and working together to oppose authoritarianism and to oppose military aggression. Critics would say, yeah, well, what about Iraq in 2003? You're saying you oppose military aggression you know, and so the bringing together of, say, democracies like India to support the effort, which is India's like, yeah, we don't necessarily think this is about democracies coming together to defend democracy against authoritarianism, because the democracies of the UK, of the US, from India's perspective, were not supporting democracy, but actually were, with the example of the Iraq War of 2003, were imperialist aggressors, telling other folks how to run their affairs. So that has made the task of bringing the community of liberal democracies together more difficult, especially for non-Western or non-US European democracies.
I have a question. You maybe hit on it a little bit when you were talking about reading in the newspaper about what's going on there. I want to know, where can you really get information about what is happening? How many deaths are there in the Russian military as opposed to the Ukrainians, et cetera, things like that?
Right. Yeah, and I mean, there is a strong incentive by both military forces to, you know, lie about their success on the battlefield, or, you know, so both sides have an incentive to say, oh, it's really going well, or we are inflicting, damage and losses on the enemy. So it's very hard. The multiple sources, of course. I think the Wall Street Journal's coverage of the war has been very good. It's surprising that it's quite similar to the coverage by the New York Times. That sometimes it's difficult to tell when you're reading the news, not the editorial page. It's sometimes difficult to tell which publication you're reading. I've been following some Twitter accounts that provide on the ground supposedly trustworthy video footage or firsthand accounts of what's happening. But yeah, it's very difficult to know, and this is part of that that information battlefield, right? To manage the narrative and what is the truth and what is happening there. It's interesting that the British intelligence services have been more I don't want to say forthright, because I'm not sure if their information is correct, but they've been putting out information, sharing with the world their intelligence that Russia's military is doing poorly. Recently, we saw reports that based on British intelligence sources that Russia's military losses could be as much as 75,000 troops, and not all deceased or killed, but wounded or taken out of action or taken out of an effective military capacity. And so those are huge losses. Right. The initial invasion was estimated to be about 150,000 Russian forces, Russian troops, as part of the military operation there. And if nearly or about half of the forces have been decimated, then that's a serious military loss. And then, of course, this is again another one of those cases where, well, if people were afraid of Russia's military, say like the Baltic states, with very good reason to be fearful of the Russia's military, say Lithuania says, oh, we're next, right? They're much less fearful of Russia's military now than they would have been a few months ago. Certainly, they recognize that, no, they will invade other countries, but just the capacity, right, to take on a large-scale military invasion in another country, I think the threat is reduced, and certainly Russia's military reputation has taken a huge hit. And so in terms of this struggle for power, it has certainly hurt the deterrent threat or the potential for Russia to take military action. And from what I've read in a variety of reports about the reason for this Russian failure in terms of the military is the corruption. Incredible corruption throughout the Russian military. And so the command and control is not anywhere near what we would imagine a capable military force to be. And that corruption goes from the top, from Putin, all the way down. And so this has weakened Russia's military power and also its military reputation, or the threat or the credibility of Russia's military. And I want to make another point. It's interesting to think about. Some have argued that it shows the strength of democracy, because when you have authoritarian governments, you have corruption. And so they can give orders and have this, oh, listen to the dictator. But if corruption is embedded in these institutions, then it makes it very difficult for those authoritarian states to mount a capable military effort against democracies where presumably you have much less corruption and you have more transparency and effective command and control.
I see a couple of things. One, the Ukrainian government has said that they're not going to give up an inch. And at the same time, there are people in the eastern part of Ukraine that are definitely culturally and from a linguistic standpoint and historically Russian. And they might like to be Russian. So the question would be, how can there come to a point where the people that are a part of that Donetsk region that really feel a part of Russia can have their way without causing a disconnect? Well, or not a disconnect, but the inability for the Ukrainian government to step in and say, no, you can't do that.
Right. Yeah, excellent. Yeah, that's a great summary or explanation. It's, we often hear the phrase identity politics in the US bashed, that, oh, identity politics, but really it's identity politics here in Ukraine. And if, you have two groups of people who don't think of themselves as having a shared identity, then where's the path forward from that difference of identity is going to continue, that where we look around the world, where there are a lot of cases in Sri Lanka and Rwanda and Israel, Palestine, where it's identity politics. It's us against them, and they want to destroy us and our identity, and we want to reclaim our identity. And so, I think it doesn't have to be war, but the tension of this identity politics and identity struggle in Ukraine, I expect to continue, into the far into the future. Yes.
Yeah, Joel, we'll make this last question for the sake of time. Can you talk briefly about Russia's susceptibility to other invasion, not just their own, but now are they susceptible to action from other agents, for example, reviving wars in Chechnya or other similar areas?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm assuming that came online. That is exactly right. And it gets to that point of exposing the weaknesses of Russia's military. It could embolden Chechen rebels. It could embolden other breakaway republics to say, now is our time to take on a weakened, damaged Russian military, and that it could lead to further instability and further war, not just in this immediate region, but throughout Russia and surrounding areas. Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. That instability breeds instability, and that's a problem. And so, yeah, great point. I just wanted to thank you all for your attendance and attentiveness, and for paying attention to this important issue. And I'll stick around for a while here afterward, and if people want to chat or give me some insights that I have maybe not shared or been aware of, I'm happy to do that. I want to though make one final point that I touched on a little bit, but the importance of, we have states and we have anarchy and we have military conflict and international institutions, multilateral institutions, and all these actors at play in global politics and international relations. And certainly we see that here, but I also want to put focus on the unit of analysis of individual leadership. I think is really important in this case. Obviously, we can look at Vladimir Putin and his leadership, if you can use that word in reference to him. Certainly that's important, right? Why did Russia invade Ukraine? Ask Vladimir Putin. I mean, you can look at the system and the bigger geopolitical picture, but it appears to be the decision of one person. So individual decision makers are significant here. And then, of course, to contrast that with Zelensky. And from what my perspective has been, his phenomenal leadership in this period of crisis. And it's, he was a comedian just a few years ago. Right? He played a comedian on a TV show in which the character accidentally became president of Ukraine. And so now he was not taken seriously by many. I think Vladimir Putin didn't take him seriously as being a strong leader or a capable leader of an independent Ukraine, but he's certainly grown into the role. And the famous line, it's unclear if he actually said this, but when the invasion first began, the United States and the West offered him safe passage to flee the country. And he supposedly said, "I need ammo, not a ride." Right? And that's just kind of like, whoa, that Churchill kind of moment where this is a leader and who is inspiring his people and indeed inspiring people around the world. It's been amazing to drive around the country a little bit recently in the US here and see Ukrainian flags, in a lot of places. And so that inspiring leadership, I think, is really a significant element to the political dynamics of this case.
Please join me in thanking Joel for an excellent presentation.
Thank you.
Help with that one lined up.
There, girl. Oh.
Yes.